February 19th, 1968. The ancient city of Hue is tearing itself apart. The air, thick with monsoon damp and cordite, echoes with the constant staccato of M16 rifles and the dull thump of incoming mortars. The Tet offensive is at its zenith, and this is its bloody epicenter. In the damp, cramped basement of a ruined university building, 14 women huddle against the concrete walls. They are Vietnamese. Some were students here, others shopkeepers, others wives of South Vietnamese ARVN soldiers. Now they are nothing but property. Above them, the battle rages as U.S. Marines fight house to house, trying to reclaim this section of the city from the Viet Cong and NVA regulars who seized it weeks before. The women listen to the approaching gunfire, not with hope, but with a hollow, practiced numbness. Their thin, black al-baba pajamas are stained with mud and fear. Their eyes, dark and vacant, shared the same 1,000-yard stare of those who have seen the bottom of humanity. For the past 3 weeks, since the VC cadre liberated this neighborhood, this basement has been their hell. It was designated a morale and re-education station by the local political officer. It was a brutal, cynical euphemism. These women, accused of being puppets or collaborators for the Americans and the Saigon government, were being re-educated through systematic rape. The system was an improvised but no less horrific echo of darker histories. The VC officer believed it served a purpose: to reward his troops, to bind them together in atrocity, and to purify the women of their supposed capitalist and colonial taints. Each night, the basement door would unbar, and fighters fresh from the front line just streets away would descend. The women learned to expect nothing but further exploitation, to disassociate, to survive. The approaching American sounds, the unfamiliar cadence of their weapons, the shouted English, brought neither hope nor terror. They were simply the harbinger of new masters. After weeks of relentless abuse, they had learned to expect nothing from men in uniform, except violation.
The approaching Marines of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, had no knowledge of what awaited them in the university compound's basement. They were 19-year-old grunts, boys from rural Ohio and industrial Texas, aged a decade by the sheer, grinding brutality of the house-to-house fight for Hue. Their world had shrunk to the next corner, the next doorway, the next rooftop. Their training and the intelligence briefings had prepared them for a savage fight. They expected NVA regulars chained to their machine guns, VC sappers emerging from spider holes, civilian sympathizers detonating grenades. They were warned about booby-trapped bodies, tripwires strung across alleys, and bouncing Betty mines hidden in the rubble. They had been indoctrinated with a mix of fear and contempt for their enemy, ruthless, cunning, and willing to fight to the last man. But nothing in their parasailing training, nothing in the grim calculus of modern warfare had prepared them for this. Their war was about killing the enemy and protecting their brothers, not confronting a systematic sexual tableau of human misery. For the women huddled in the dark, the approaching sounds were a new kind of terror. The sharp, rapid pop-pop-pop of the VC's AK-47s was being steadily overwhelmed by the deeper, heavier thwack of M16s and the terrifying whoosh of a flamethrower. Their VC captors, in their final moments of control, had reinforced their psychological warfare. The American long noses are coming. The political officer had sneered at them just that morning, his own eyes wide with fear. They are animals. They will skin you alive. They are cannibals who will feast on your bodies. It was a horrific projection of their own crimes, a last-ditch effort to ensure the women remained broken and terrified. Some of the women, particularly the younger students, believed it. They whispered about saving a shard of glass, about how to bite their own tongues hard enough to drown in the blood, rather than face what they believed would be an even worse fate. In the darkest corner, Lien, a 20-year-old literature student, clutched a small jade amulet, a linguet for good fortune, the last remnant of her life before the offensive. She had been taken because her father, a professor, was deemed unrevolutionary. The amulet, a gift from her grandmother, had somehow remained hidden in the hem of her pajamas. As the American shouts grew louder just outside the basement door, she pressed the cool stone into her palm, uncertain whether to pray for a quick death or a deliverance that promised only new horrors.
February 24th, 1968. The fight for Hue has become a meat grinder, but Fox Company has finally secured the university's ruined library complex. Lance Corporal David Ski Kowalski, a 19-year-old from Chicago, leads his fire team on a systematic sweep of the adjoining buildings. His M16 is held low, his boots crunching on shattered porcelain and VC propaganda leaflets. They'd been warned this whole area was a free fire zone, but intel said NVA stragglers were holed up in the basements. They clear 3 rooms, empty save for the debris of war. Ski gestures with 2 fingers to his point man, who kicks open the last door at the end of a moldy hallway. It leads down a short flight of concrete stairs into darkness. Ski clicks on the flashlight mounted to his rifle barrel, its beam cutting the gloom. The smell hits him first, a physical blow. It's not just the damp rot of the monsoon. It's the acidic, unmistakable stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, stale blood, and pure, concentrated desperation. He gags, signaling his team to hold. Clear, his point man whispers from the bottom, and Ski descends. As his eyes adjust, the flashlight beam sweeps across the room and finds them, a huddled mass of forms pressed against the far wall. His finger tightens on the trigger, his training screaming VC, ambush, suicide vests. But they aren't moving, they're just watching. 14 women, their faces streaked with filth, their black pajamas torn, staring at him with eyes that are not just empty, but burned out. They look like figures from a medieval painting of the plague. His training had prepared him to kill enemy combatants, to breach doors, to call in fire missions. It had not prepared him for this tableau of silent, abject human misery. Jesus Christ, Ski whispers, the words fogging in the damp air. He lowers his rifle. The women flinch at his voice, a collective, sharp intake of breath. He sees one of them, the young student Lien, clutch the jade amulet at her neck. "Hey, Doc," Ski yells back up the stairs, his voice cracking. "Get the doc. We got civilians down here. Jesus." The historical encounter between the Hue women and the American Marines was a profound clash of expectations and realities. For the women, conditioned by weeks of relentless violation, the arrival of new, heavily armed men was not liberation. It was a change of masters. They had been taught by their trauma that all soldiers were threats. The VC propaganda, which painted the Americans as cannibalistic monsters, now seemed like a terrifying prophecy about to be fulfilled. As the other Marines fanned out to secure the basement, the women cringed, pulling their legs in, trying to make themselves small, bracing for the inevitable. For the Marines, this was a different kind of war. Their training was for violence, not for this. They were used to the adrenaline of the breach, the unambiguous morality of kill or be killed. This silent, stinking room full of broken women forced them to confront a depth of human cruelty that even the gore of the battlefield had not prepared them for. Their hard-bitten cynicism wavered, replaced by a disgusted, angry compassion. A Navy corpsman, a 20-year-old named PJ with a thin mustache, pushed past Ski, his medical bag slapping his hip. He knelt in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the women. Lien watched him with terror. He looked different from the VC cadres, bigger, wearing a different uniform. But he was still a soldier. He would use her body like the others, perhaps worse. PJ saw her, saw the absolute dread in her eyes, and moved toward her, his movement slow, hands visible. He unclipped a canteen from his belt and offered it. Lien flinched, turning her head. He set it on the floor in front of her. Then he dug into his thigh pocket and pulled out a foil-wrapped pack of Charms candy, the hard candy squares included in every sea ration. He unwrapped one and slid it, along with the canteen, toward her. It was a simple gift, but it was the first item she had received from a soldier in weeks that did not come with the implicit, violent expectation of sexual servitude in return.
"It's okay," PJ said softly, his voice echoing in the small space. He tried a word of Vietnamese he'd learned. "Bin thin. It's water. Nuoc. You're safe now." Lien just stared, her mind unable to process the gesture. The candy, a symbol of American abundance, lay on the filthy concrete, a stark emblem of a different kind of power, one that could choose to nurture rather than just exploit.
In his official after-action report, the 2nd 5th Battalion surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Marks, would later document the state of the 14 women evacuated from the university complex. The women were found in an advanced state of malnutrition, his report stated clinically, exacerbated by the siege conditions. However, many also showed signs of severe physical abuse, including ligature marks, blunt force trauma, and cigarette burns inconsistent with combat operations. Medical examinations later at the Da Nang Field Hospital revealed widespread venereal infections and septic complications from repeated sexual trauma. The report noted they displayed symptoms of acute psychological distress bordering on catatonia. This mistrust was absolute. In the immediate chaos of the Hue basement, PJ the Corpsman faced a wall of profound, terrified resistance. The women's experiences had taught them a single, brutal lesson. Men in uniform, regardless of the flag, represented danger, not salvation. When PJ tried to check a deep, infected gash on one woman's arm, she shrieked, a high, thin sound, and scrambled away, disappearing into the darkest corner. They initially refused medical treatment, appearing to believe the American personnel would harm them. For the Marines, the discovery presented a critical challenge, both humanitarian and strategic. They were still in a hot combat zone. Snipers were active on the street outside, and the thump of mortars was constant. They had no way to establish trust with victims who had every reason to fear them. How do we provide care for traumatized women when we can't even get an interpreter in here and they look at us like we're the devil? Ski radioed to his platoon leader. PJ realized the core problem. "Ski, it's us," he said, pulling back. "We're the problem. We're men, in uniforms." He was remembering his training on hearts and minds, but this was deeper. They're terrified we're just next. In a later interview, a combat correspondent who arrived on the scene would recall, they wouldn't let any male personnel near them. Some would scream if a man in uniform entered their field of vision. The corpsman had to create a perimeter and ask the grunts to stay back, using only himself and one other man to slowly coax them out. The platoon lieutenant, a 24-year-old Mustang, made the call. They're non-coms, victims of war crimes. We're moving them to the battalion aid station. It was a protocol improvised in the heat of battle, an attempt to impose order on a situation far outside their mandate.
April 1968. The Marines have moved south, but the war's detritus remains. In a sprawling field hospital in Da Nang, set up in a former girls' high school, Lien sits on the edge of a clean army cot. 2 months have passed since that day in the Hue basement. The physical wounds are healing. She has gained weight. The hollows in her cheeks, carved out by starvation and terror, have begun to fill in as regular meals restore what the siege had taken. The infections have been treated, but her body remains a stranger to her. Her eyes still dart nervously toward the doorway when male voices, American doctors, ARVN liaisons, carry from the hallway. Her muscles still tense, a coiled spring reflex in anticipation of a violation that no longer comes. An American woman approaches, her boots silent on the tile. She's a volunteer from the American Red Cross, her clipboard a symbol of sterile Western order. She smiles gently at Lien. With her is a South Vietnamese interpreter, an older woman whose eyes are kind but weary. They are helping locate families displaced by the offensive, the interpreter explains in soft, precise Vietnamese. The American lady wishes to know where your family is. They want to know if you wish to return home. Lien's hands twist in the lap of her borrowed pajamas. Home. The word feels like it belongs to another language, another life.
Her home in Hue was destroyed. Her father, she didn't know if her father was alive or dead, executed by the VC or killed by American artillery. But that wasn't the problem. How could she return to her village, to her surviving aunts and cousins, carrying the unspeakable shame of what was done to her? How could she face them, knowing the uses to which her body had been put? In her culture, a woman's purity was her family's honor. The stigma of what happened, being used by the VC, would mark her as permanently defiled, ruined, who hung. It didn't matter that it was violence. The shame would be hers. The end of her physical captivity in the basement did not mean liberation. This cultural attitude, this burden of shame placed on the victim, rather than the perpetrator, was an invisible prison that would confine her for the rest of her life.
June 1968. The war rages on, but in this fortified hospital compound in Da Nang, a different battle is being fought. The struggle to reclaim lives shattered by the Tet Offensive. Lien has become an informal leader among the 14 survivors. Her university English, rusty at first, has improved rapidly, allowing her to serve as a bridge between the traumatized women and their American caretakers. Today, she sits across from Captain John Miller, an Army intelligence officer tasked with documenting Viet Cong atrocities committed during the battle for Hue. Between them, on the metal table, in the oppressive heat of the briefing room, is a can of Coca-Cola, beaded with condensation. Miller had offered it from a small cooler. This simple, cold drink, a symbol of American logistical magic and abundance, contrasts sharply with the watery rice gruel and fear of the VC's basement re-education station. Lien holds the cold can, feeling its weight. Food and drink remain precious. Each meal she takes, each sip of clean water, is a quiet reminder that her body is now her own again, to nourish, not to be used. "We need to understand what happened, Miss Lien," Captain Miller says gently, a tape recorder spinning slowly on the table. "Your testimony can help ensure this is part of the historical record." Lien nods slowly. Justice, she knows, is an abstract word for men with guns. What justice could possibly balance the scales against what was taken from her and the others? Still, she begins to speak. She provides the names of the VC cadres she recognized, the details of the political officer, the timeline of the horror. Her voice, at first a whisper, grows steadier as she gives the events a shape in the official record. The documentation gathered by MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, about the Hue Massacre and other VC war crimes would become a key part of the American historical narrative. But the specific issue of systematic rape, like the comfort women before them, received insufficient attention, lost in the larger story of mass executions and battlefield statistics. The VC propaganda had depicted Americans as bloodthirsty monsters who would rape and murder them. The reality for Lien was profoundly different. While violations by American GIs certainly occurred, no army in history has a spotless record. The systematic, command-sanctioned sexual slavery she had just endured had no equivalent in American military policy. For Lien, the most profound shock was not the violence of her rescue, but the absence of abuse afterward. After weeks of conditioning to expect violation from any man in uniform, the professional, almost awkward conduct of the Marines and the gentle care of the corpsmen was a deeply disorienting contrast. In a later debrief, she would tell a Red Cross worker, we thought we were just being transferred. We were waiting for the Americans to take their turn. When they gave us candy and water and wouldn't touch us, we cried. We didn't understand. After so long, the absence of rape was its own kind of shock.
This testimony highlights the tragic reality of their conditioning. For Lien and the other women from the Hue basement, sexual violence at the hands of uniformed men had become so normalized, so expected, that its absence was profoundly disorienting. Their identities had been systematically reduced by the VC cadres, from student or shopkeeper to collaborator, a sexual object to be used for re-education, to suddenly be treated as human beings. Victims who required medical care, food, and dignity was not an immediate relief. It was a painful, complex psychological reorientation. August 1968. The echoes of the Tet Offensive have faded in Da Nang, replaced by the bureaucratic hum of the massive American war machine. In the recovery center, American authorities and ARVN officials work to repatriate the thousands of displaced persons. The news from Hue is grim. The war has destroyed what the VC did not. For Lien, the jade amulet she had clutched in the darkness has become a symbol, not just of her past, but of a possible future. As she watches the other women from the basement being processed, some sent to refugee camps, others disappearing into the anonymity of Da Nang slums, she makes a decision that surprises even herself. She will not return to Hue. She cannot go back to a culture that, despite its kindness, would view her as damaged goods. Hu Hung, a woman permanently stained by what was done to her. Instead, she has applied for a job, a position as a translator for the USAID office, working with civilian refugees. Her facility with English, her sharp university mind, these are now valuable in a way that has nothing to do with her body. The sound of American military boots in the hallway no longer triggers a flight response. It just means the doctors are making their morning rounds. The cokes and candies, once miraculous symbols, have become mundane. In this newfound normalcy, in the daily interactions where her mind rather than her body was the only thing required, she has begun to slowly, carefully reclaim the parts of herself the war had nearly extinguished. The diverse paths taken by the 14 women from the Hue basement reflected the chaotic complexity of recovery in a war zone. Historical records and NGO reports from the time show that while some women, like Lien, found work with allied authorities or relief organizations, many did not. Some were transferred to sprawling refugee camps outside Da Nang, only to disappear into the vast, anonymous population of the displaced. Others returned to what was left of their home villages, carrying their trauma in silence, fearing the stigma that would mark them as used by the VC. But there was another path, one that Lien began to see with growing horror from her new desk at the USAID compound. This was the contradiction of the American presence, a hypocrisy that revealed the limited understanding of sexual exploitation in the era. The American forces had been genuinely horrified by the VC's systematic, brutal re-education system. Yet the very presence of 500,000 American GIs, with their wallets full of US dollars, had created a massive parallel economy of sexual exploitation. In the streets outside the fortified compounds, a vast industry of bar girls, massage parlors, and brothels flourished, catering to American soldiers on R&R. The American military command, while officially discouraging fraternization, tacitly permitted this system. It was seen as a necessary outlet for troop morale, just as the Japanese officers had once rationalized their own comfort stations. For Lien, this was a bitter pill. The men who had rescued her, who had shown her a profound, disorienting kindness, were part of the same machine that was now consuming other women. These Vietnamese women, many of them refugees who had lost everything, were not abducted at gunpoint. They were coerced by a more insidious force, economic desperation. They chose this life because the war had left them no other choice. It was a voluntary system, born of profound power imbalances and the raw poverty created by the conflict. One evening, processing refugee applications, Lien looked up and saw a familiar face. It was Mai, one of the younger women from the basement. Her eyes were just as vacant as they had been in Hue, but now they were framed with thick, smudged American eyeliner. She was applying for a health card, a requirement for women working in the bars. Lien felt a cold sickness. The Americans had liberated them from one hell, only for their presence to create another.
September 1970. 2 years have passed in the bureaucratic grind of war. Lien stands on the tarmac of the Da Nang Air Base, the roar of a freedom bird, a C-141 Starlifter, filling the humid air. Her work as a translator for USAID has been noticed. An older American civilian official, impressed by her intelligence and grim determination, has pulled strings, arranging for a university sponsorship in the United States. It's an opportunity so rare, it feels like a dream.
The small jade amulet still hangs around her neck, hidden beneath her new American-style blouse. It is no longer her only possession. She carries a single worn suitcase containing a few clothes, several English books, and the official letter of recommendation that is her passport to a new life. As she walks toward the yawning rear ramp of the transport plane, she thinks about the women she is leaving behind. She thinks of those who return to families in villages now controlled by the VC or shattered by American bombs, their pasts buried in silent shame. She thinks of Mai, lost to the neon-lit bars of Tudo Street in Saigon. She thinks of the women who didn't even survive the basement in Hue, killed by the crossfire. She alone, among the 14, is making this journey toward an impossible future across the ocean. The transformation she has undergone is not simply from victim to survivor. Though she is that, it is a deeper, more profound shift from an object to a subject. For 3 weeks in that basement, she was a thing, defined entirely by what was being done to her. Now she is a woman actively charting her own course. The Marines who found her, PJ the corpsman with his candy and water, the officers who processed her as a victim and not a conquest, they had, in their restraint, delivered a more profound liberation than they could ever realize. Their adherence to a different, incomprehensible standard of conduct had created a small, clean space in her mind, a space where she could begin to reclaim her own humanity. The jade amulet feels warm against her skin. She faces the new world not as a He Hong woman, not as a casualty of war, but simply as Lien, carrying her wounds, but no longer defined by them.
The epilogue for Lien and the women from the Hue basement reflects the chaotic, often unjust possibilities of history. While Lien's journey to America was an extraordinary path that few, if any, of the other survivors could follow, the post-war period offered different, often bleaker fates. Historical records and refugee accounts show some women simply vanished, absorbed by the sprawling camps or the desperate neon-lit bar districts of Saigon. Others eventually returned to their villages, but only by maintaining a rigid, absolute silence about their re-education under the VC. They married, built new families, and kept their pasts buried, a dark secret hidden even from their spouses and children. For many, the physical and psychological consequences were lifelong. They suffered from chronic infections, sterility resulting from the brutal, untreated sexual trauma, and a permanent shadow of fear that never truly left their eyes. The most profound silence, however, was political. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, the new, unified communist government of Vietnam had no interest in acknowledging the war crimes committed by its heroic cadres during the Tet Offensive. The official narrative was one of glorious liberation. The stories of the women from the Hue basement, if they were ever spoken, were dismissed as puppet propaganda or simply erased from history. There would be no public reckoning in Vietnam, no government apologies or commissions. The truth only began to emerge decades later, in whispers, in harrowing memoirs published by the Vietnamese diaspora in America and France, far from the reach of the Hanoi government. The American encounter in that Hue basement reveals a complex, difficult truth. Even in humanity's darkest chapters, individual choices matter. While the American presence fueled a devastating economic system of sexual exploitation in the cities, the individual Marines who breached that basement made a different choice. While some American soldiers in Vietnam certainly treated local women as conquests, many others, like PJ and his C-ration Candy, responded to human suffering with a stunned, awkward compassion and, most critically, with restraint.
The jade amulet that Lin carried from the Hue basement to the Da Nang hospital, and finally to America, represents something profound about human resilience. It is the capacity to preserve an essential core piece of one's identity, even through the most brutal and dehumanizing experiences. Like that small, hard stone, something within the human spirit resists complete erasure. It maintains the possibility of renewal, even after the most profound violation. For the women in that basement, who had been conditioned to expect nothing but sexual exploitation from men in uniform, the American soldiers' restraint offered something more profound than just safety. It offered a glimpse of a different world, a world where men in power, armed, exhausted, and brutalized by combat, might choose not to abuse that power. It was a vision of freedom more fundamental than simply changing masters. In the charms candy and the C-ration crackers, in the awkwardly offered canteen of water, and, most importantly, in the absence of the expected violation, these women experienced not just physical liberation, but the first agonizing steps toward reclaiming their own dignity. The freedom that arrived with the American Marines in Hue was never complete, nor was it simple. The women who survived carried the wounds of their re-education for the rest of their lives, just as the new Vietnamese government, in its denial, carried the moral debt of that failure. But in that one moment, in that foul-smelling basement, when expected exploitation did not materialize, a different kind of liberation became possible. It was not just freedom from the chains of the VC, but the freedom to imagine a world where human dignity might one day be honored. In the endless blood-soaked fields of the Vietnam War, filled with atrocities committed by all sides, these moments stand like small, stubborn shoots of green. They do not erase the devastation, but they testify to the possibility of renewal. The story of the Hue women reminds us that while humanity's capacity for cruelty may seem bottomless, so too is our capacity for resilience, for compassion, and, however improbably, for hope.